Thank you, Madam President. At the outset, I wish to congratulate you on your assumption of the presidency of the Security Council for this month. Our congratulations and thanks also go to our fellow ambassador of Lebanon for presiding ably over the business of the Council last month. Madam President, the unprecedented, aggressive language resorted by certain ambassadors against my country, against the political leaders of my country, facilitated my task today. For the discourse they came up with underscored what we have said and what other friendly ambassadors have said, namely that my country is targeted by our enemies in principle and not under any humanitarian pretext whatsoever. This aggressive discourse, Madam President, reveals the prejudice in certain Western capitals against my country, the political leadership of Syria, because of our independent political positions, independent from the agendas of those capitals, those very capitals. Madam President, on the 3rd of this month, 3rd of October this year, an armed terrorist group assassinated Sari Hassoun, the son of the General Mufti, a leading spiritual figure of the Syrian Republic, and Dr. Muhammad Omar, history professor at the University of Aleppo. A few days ago, precisely on the 29th of September, another armed group, terrorist group, assassinated Aus Abdel Karim Khalil, nuclear engineer and the dean of the University of Homs. 2 days before that, on the 27th of September, an armed terrorist group, a third one, assassinated Nail Adakhil, dean of the chemistry college at the University of Homs, as well as Muhammad Aqil, dean of the architecture college at the University of Homs. On the 25th of September, a fourth armed terrorist group assassinated Dr. Hassan Aid, head of the heart division at the National Hospital in Homs. All these crimes were committed during the same week. Unfortunately, they were added to the 800 officials in the army, in the police forces, and to a similar number of our civilian citizens who all were killed, and we are deeply saddened at that. The armed terrorist groups inaugurated a new epoch of terrorism, targeting the state, the institution, and the military, the universities of Syria, by assassinating our scientific, medical, educational, and spiritual leading figures. despite this terrible hemorrhage of our homeland as a whole, my country, of whom I'm proud, my country, Syria, certain states that are leading the international campaign to intervene in Syria under the pretext of human rights and the protection of civilians, these countries continue to refuse or continue to reject the existence of these terrorist groups in Syria for reasons that are known to all. Moreover, these states continue to protect and sponsor the leaders of these terrorist groups whom they host in their capitals. They continue to convene a conference after another where they declare to enter into dialogue with our government. Notably that these states are infamous for their black register in the fields of human rights and fundamental freedoms. I don't think that anybody ignores the massacres and human rights violations that were committed in Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Algeria, and many African countries, in Iraq and Afghanistan, Libya as well, in the prisons of Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo, and secret prisons in Europe, just to state a few. We have stated previously that Syria is beleaguered by a two-faceted problem. The first facet is that the country really needs economic, political, and social reforms. Reforms that are called for by the masses and the country needs. And this is what we are striving to achieve. The second facet is the misuse by the needs of the masses for purposes that are diametrically opposed to the desires of the Syrian people. And the misuse of these needs as a ladder for the external opposition so as to stir sectarian commotion and pave the way for external intervention and for calling upon this external intervention. All of these are categorically rejected by the Syrian people, including by the honest domestic opposition. In this connection, certain parties inside the Security Council continue to implicate the Council in domestic Syrian affairs, which is a tremendous disservice to the rule of law and which runs counter, or rather, which is in the interest of certain agendas of those parties against Syria under unfounded pretext. And under the pretext of the maintenance of international peace and security, and not in the interest of the security and stability in Syria. We are astounded at this unobjective political trend that strives in an absurd and frantic manner to undermine stability, security, and coexistence in the whole region in general and in Syria in particular, with defamation to Syria and to its stature at the Arab regional and international levels. These parties, time and again, abused of the Council as a cover-up for implementing their intervention in our domestic affairs. And even when these parties were faced by the desire of the remaining states on this council to rise above these interventions. We noted that the former resorted to unilateral actions outside the framework of international legality to implement their political and military schemes. Hence, these parties exported outside the international legality NATO to many member states of this international organization to undermine its political stability, plunder their riches, and to spread the so-called creative anarchy therein. However, and this is a paradox, these parties only exported veto 50 times since 1945 to the Palestinians in order to deprive them of their legitimate rights and to prevent the establishment of their state. A particular state used the veto power 50 times to protect Israel, and it continues to threat the use of the veto power. This could be considered as partaking in a genocide, as this conduct is tantamount to turning a blind eye and supporting the Israeli massacres in occupied Arab lands, let alone the misuse of the developments in Syria to divert international public opinion away from the legitimate Palestinian demands to have a fully fledged membership within the United Nations. Madam President, the Syrian leadership responded quickly and immediately to the legitimate demands of the masses in Syria. President Bashar al-Assad announced a comprehensive package of reform, which our government is implementing by enacting a myriad of laws and legislation, enhancing the democratic process and expanding the participation of our citizens in the political and economic processes, in total isolation of the external evaluations and positions that have nothing to do with our domestic affairs. Reforms in Syria have become tangible realities on the ground that cannot be ignored. They are ongoing despite the attempts by those who are outside our country to curtail and hinder these reforms by various means. Madam President, no state can claim that it is more desirous to guarantee the safety and security of our citizens, since the unfortunate and painful events in our country. We have strived to guarantee the security and safety of each citizen. We have also endeavored to continue the provision of basic services, food and medicine without delay, despite the hasty imposition of economic sanctions which were imposed unilaterally outside international consensus against my country. As we strive to stand against Israeli and Western hegemony against my country. These measures were used as pressure to bear on the Syrian population and their livelihoods. This is why resorting to the so-called humanitarian situation is only a pretext to intervene in our domestic affairs. in a harmful way to our leaders and our country in the interest of external political agendas that have nothing to do with the desire to promote the humanitarian situation in Syria. Syria received delegations from OCHA and a delegation from the International Committee of the Red Cross, presided by the chairman of the committee, who met our President Bashar al-Assad. They found for themselves the provocation and incitement and propaganda by certain circles to deform the facts. Madam President, certain council members tried of late to intervene in our domestic affairs under the pretext of protection of civilians. Here we only wonder, where have you been? Why didn't you protect civilians in Palestine, the occupied Syrian Golan, southern Lebanon, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya, when their citizens were beleaguered by crimes against humanity and crimes of war? Isn't it interesting that the delegate of France on the 14th of July this year, isn't it interesting that he extended thanks to Israel for its aggressive actions against Syria in 2007? Don't you consider that an encouragement to and promotion of aggression? Isn't it against all the customs of the international community and all the ethics that reject the might as a solution? The international legal framework governing international relations is based on the principle of non-interference in the domestic affairs of states. It has been enshrined in a myriad of international instruments, chief among them the Charter of the United Nations. Therefore, the calls by certain circles to topple the legitimate government in Syria is an incitement, irresponsible incitement, in order to undermine the stability of Syria, encouraging the radical demands of the opposition in Syria to topple the government by arms, violence, and terrorists is a coup from outside our country, and it is not reform. Don't you think that the political declaration by certain leaders of countries on this council that the Syrian president has lost his legitimacy and therefore he should step down? Don't you think that this is a blatant breach of international law and the Charter of the United Nations? Isn't this tantamount to hindrance of national reforms by inciting the Syrian people on the streets against the legitimate Syrian leadership? These are questions that we leave to you to answer. Madam President, we are hopeful that the United Nations and its member states will be of assistance to Syria to face up to attempts of terrorism and extremism and instability. Hasty positions should not be used as a cover-up for political pressure to encourage armed extremist groups. Here we wish to confirm that the intervention by the Security Council in the domestic Syrian affairs further worsens the situation, sends a message to extremists and terrorists that their action of sabotage, deliberate sabotage and violence are supported by the Security Council, actions that no country can be lenient to. Madam President, Syria, similar to other member states of this organization, including member states of this august council, have problems that need reform. If there is anybody here who has no problems and needs no reform, they can cast a stone on us. If the greedy objectives of our enemies inside this council and outside this council have been fulfilled elsewhere at a price of stability, security, safety of other countries, I can underscore that Syria will stand adamant against any plot targeting its sovereignty, independence, and its stability, as well as its independent political decisions. Therefore, we reject the maneuvers of the sponsors of this draft resolution, which have just failed. These maneuvers that attack my country and its stature in the international arena. The strength, or rather prestige, is more important than might. The sponsors of this draft resolution lost their prestige, and now they have resorted to might and power, for they lost the respect of the majority of member states of this organization. In this conduct, they are undermining international legality, and they are leading the whole world into a new colonial era and military adventures that are bound and doomed to failure. These very states led the whole world to 2 world wars, claimed millions of lives on our planet. They caused untold suffering for millions in Asia, Africa, and Latin America due to their colonial conduct, their excavation, and their attitude. In closing, I wish to extend thanks and appreciation to the friendly states that rejected the misuse and abuse of this council as a tool to harm the interest of my country, its political independence, its security and stability. If we are optimistic about this council, it is due to the fact that we continue to hear the voice of the wise echoing on this council, a voice that calls for extending a hand to Syria to face up to the difficulties and to encourage the Syrian government to push ahead with the reforms and to call on the external opposition to enter into a comprehensive dialogue so as to build Syria, a Syria for all our citizens without any pretext, without any exception. I thank you, Madam.